All right, hello everybody. I can't see everyone's videos like I'm used to when I do my teaching in Zoom. Um, maybe could I ask those of you that can hear me and that have popped in, can you give me the little thumbs up reaction at the bottom so I can see if I should get started or not?
Yeah,
We've got quite a few there. Okay, so my name is Matt Evans. I'm a saxophonist in the U.S. Army Band. I play baritone saxophone in the concert band. As you might imagine, the military bands have a really interesting role in what's going on right now. All of our public performances have been canceled. My unit has really started doing some cool streaming projects. If you check out the usarmyband.com, we've started following all CDC guidelines, a new series of chamber music programs, along with some pre-recorded things that we're streaming, I think, fairly daily at this point. But I'm in uniform today. I was actually part of a military detail at Fort McNair, and that's one of the reasons that Professor Nate Knabb asked if we could move this to the evening because I was unable at 3 p.m. Eastern is what it'd be for me to do this. But I'm kind of here in my official Army Band capacity a little bit today. But I also teach saxophone at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I'm going to be talking about some ideas for arranging and transcribing for saxophone. Most of my experience with this, I'm involved in two saxophone quartets, the Sax Quartet and Project Fusion. And then when I was completing my doctoral work at the Eastman School of Music, I was the assistant director slash head arranger of ESP for about a year and a half. And basically all my arranging experience has been hands-on, sort of project-driven in that chamber music setting. So I wanted to kind of share with everyone some things I've learned, so sort of some tips. So we'll go through anecdotally some of the arrangements I've done. If I can keep using Zoom correctly, you should be able to hear some audio files, and I'll share the scores with you as we go. And then lastly, I wanted to devote a little bit of time at the end to discuss sort of the more artistic reasons behind arranging. And I'll sprinkle that in at the beginning, but just know the first half of this is going to be kind of looking at scores and discussing tactics, and then at the end I just kind of want to talk about what does it mean to actually do an arrangement, perform an arrangement in public. So I have asked Ellie, who is our MC, our Zoom MC here, to keep track of any questions that pop up in the chat. So feel free if there's anything that I've glossed over that you maybe want to ask me about, maybe save most questions for the end, but feel free to ask them along the way. We will get started here. I think most people have arrived. All right, so first, I wanted to just lay out what do you need to create an arrangement. I recommend using some sort of notation software. We're sort of in this interesting period right now where a lot of parts and arrangements are being distributed by PDF. So one big thing that you might want to know before tackling any sort of arrangement is this going to be something you're going to print off and share in-person sheet music or send to someone that they're going to print off? Or are the people going to be reading off iPads? Because if you're reading off some sort of digital screen, you don't need to worry about page turns. Or at least you can format the parts in a way that's a little bit different than when you're formatting things for publication. I have used Finale, Sebelius. I haven't had much experience with any of the open source notation options that are out there. But for revisions, going back and changing things, I find notation software seems to be the best way to go, although I have written some stuff out by hand. And then the second thing I really want to suggest to everyone, I think this is important for a lot of reasons, is I think you really need to have a deep, solid foundation and understanding of music theory, particularly voice leading and counterpoint, before you tackle any arrangement. So If you're arranging a let's just use quartet as an example, right? If you're in a saxophone quartet and you want to do a string quartet arrangement, that can be a straightforward process, right? You take a line for line, soprano, alto, tenor, bari, as long as the ranges work, and just lay it out for saxophone quartet. That's more of a transcription, right? You're just taking music and hitting a transpose button and doing your best to perform it. But if you're going to be taking a piece, say a solo violin piece or a piano piece, or for a saxophone ensemble, even an orchestral or a wind ensemble piece, and kind of adapting it for a smaller saxophone ensemble, I think having an understanding of how voice leading and harmony and counterpoint between the outer voices work can really help you. Because one of there's sort of things I've discovered about the saxophone that through arranging, I've just heard when I've created an arrangement and heard it back. Some things to keep in mind are the overtone series is super present on the saxophone. So the upper range will generally always sound louder than the lower range, right? And that's why if you've ever played in a saxophone ensemble before, and the soprano section just always sounds like they are covering the bass instruments. I found when the soprano saxophones are ledger lines above the staff, they almost always take over anything below the staff in the lower instruments. So acoustically, just knowing what we're dealing with, we have this limited range, normal range of 2.5 octaves, and the upper range tends to counterbalance the lower range. And even when you go into altissimo, generally that can even sound stronger most of the time. What I'm going to touch on a little bit are some orchestration suggestions to deal with some of those balance issues. But I want to find a way after this to share a PDF sort of handout with everyone. Give me a second here to work the share screen option. I want to show everyone a good shortcut if it's been a while since you took Theory 202 or 201. My favorite set of voice leading rules and guidelines comes from Steve Lates' The Complete Musician. He was my master's advisor. When I was at Eastman, I used my doctoral elective credits to get a music theory pedagogy degree. And in his book, he has, normally we're used to associating voice leading rules with really, really awful, mundane 4-measure exercises that you get back and someone's told you what you can and can't do with music. But I hope everyone can kind of see this okay. I will make it available after we're done here today. But just to briefly go over what he puts in his textbook. By the way, I highly recommend that theory textbook for anyone to look through, because I think it just has really great musical examples. Again, a lot of people associate in their theory education the boiling down of music into these little tiny cells, and I just find I found it when teaching out of his book that he had really, really solid, great repertoire to demonstrate everything he talked about. So some general voice leading and counterpoint rules. Move the voices as little as possible when changing chords. Resolve tendency tones by step. That's huge. Knowing how when you're arranging a tonal piece of music, where lines are headed, mostly in the outer voices. This will all come into play in ways that I show you later in the presentation here. I like too that he writes rule and then guideline, meaning this is a rule as well, but it's not quite as important as the first rule. Maintain independence in musical territory for each voice. That's super important because we play a transposing instrument in an ensemble setting. Each line has its own range anyway. Let's see here. Construct chords logically. Write complete chords. Doubling rules. Again, if you're arranging a Strauss tone poem for a saxophone ensemble, you're not going to be able to write every single note that's in that piece for sax ensemble. You have to make some decisions and sort of know, have something to fall back on, musical knowledge to recreate the sound of that. One of the examples I'm going to use is actually my good friend Danelle Espinoza arranged. Some of you may have encountered this online because it was sort of controversial when we did it in 2013 when the Eastman Saxophone Project played the Rite of Spring. And that's, of course, a piece for full orchestra that he boiled down to 13 parts. And that was a lot of fun to play. I think he did a great job with it. Again, I'll make this available. You can, basically any theory, textbook, or your notes from class will come in handy when you're arranging. But now that I've gone over that, I'm going to tell you what you're about to witness me doing is a systematic breaking of many of these rules. And that's, again, to go back to my first point, having a solid theory understanding, a deep understanding of tonal music. When you go to either follow or break a rule, you're making artistic decisions that affect the beauty and meaning of the music we play. And so I think, when it comes to counterpoint and voice leading, again, it's not a prescription. It's not like, oh, do this, don't do this. It's kind of knowing how most music works, and then you get to decide, when you're making an arrangement, artistically, how much you want to bend those sort of things. So, for instance, I'll just give you a heads up. There's something in here that says avoid voice crossings, and I'm going to talk about how that can be a really good idea. To swap alto over soprano, or tenor over alto, or even tenor under bari, to make things sound better. So again, that's just a point of reference, and making sure you have a solid understanding of harmony before you go tackling certain pieces when you're arranging. I feel like I maybe glossed over this, but I'm primarily going to be talking about arranging for saxophone ensembles today. And before we go on and look at the actual saxophone ensemble pieces, I think it's worth noting, because arranging, the act of arranging, like sitting down and arranging a piece, to me is an innately collaborative process, unless you're setting out to just arrange something for publication, that you want other people to play and purchase. So I'm going to mostly be talking about techniques for sax quartet and saxophone ensemble. Obviously, a lot of this that I talk about will apply if you're arranging a solo piece. And maybe at the end, if anyone has any questions, we could talk about like some Bach solo works and how you might adapt them for solo instrument. But by and large, the act of arranging is done for ensembles, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about here. So, okay, let's dig in. First thing, I think it's really important that you approach arranging, understanding what is idiomatic for the saxophone, okay? And I made my husband really mad when I asked him last week preparing for this. It was like, everyone thinks that their instrument sounds like the human voice, and, I do think that there are some qualities about the saxophone that sound like someone singing. And I said, you're a vocal coach, tell me, about all the different registers of the human voice. So we started talking about head voice and chest voice, and then I was like, oh, does it apply to this? And he got mad at me because he's like, no, vocal coaching is is an art form and you can't boil it down. But what I took away from that, what could have been an argument with my husband, was they're kind of, and saxophonists all maybe feel this to a certain extent, like qualities of the ranges we play in. Saxophone tends to live really well in the middle of the staff. Or a few ledger lines above and below. Things respond well. It's easy to play melodies and lines and execute. When you get down super low and when you get up super high, things get a little more difficult for, just talking in terms of idiom. So I will say, of course, if you have 4 Vincent Davids and a saxophone quartet playing together, there's probably nothing that quartet couldn't do, right? But and again, if you're arranging for your friends, a set of people, and you know what they're good at and what they like to do, you can definitely take that into account. I definitely did that with my the arrangement I did of Homlin's Etude after Alcan. That was arranged specifically for Zizeks. I mean, I had played with that group for 10 years and knew exactly what Stacy and Steven and Dana were really good at, and I kind of included that in the arrangement itself. But keeping in mind, if you're going to distribute any of your work that you do to other groups, and a lot of the music that ESP has done has been shared with other ensembles, I like to live by the mantra that a good arrangement will play itself. If you put all the thought into the writing and how it's going to come across when people just sit down and read and play, then I think you've succeeded in creating a good arrangement, right? Which is an adaptation of the original work to be played again. Keeping those things in mind, I'm going to talk about some ideas related to key signatures, transposition, orchestration, tessitura, intonation, and balance when you're creating an arrangement. So let's see here. I'm going to quickly screen share. Oh, you've been looking at the voice leading rules the whole time. Sorry about that. I'm going to quickly share a completely subjective chart of what I consider to be good and bad keys for saxophone quartet and saxophone ensemble. And again, could a few of you give me a thumbs up if you can see this okay? If it's too big or too small? I can zoom in maybe a little bit. Actually, I can't. It's not working. Okay, so what I have outlined here, obviously, green, yellow, and red, go, hold up a second, and stop. And what I've outlined here are, first, let's talk about the lower voices. Depending on whether the lowest instrument that you're including in an arrangement is for baritone or bass saxophone, I outline scale degrees 1 and 5, right? Your tonic and the dominant. And on the lower instruments, it's better to have tonic and dominant notes that have a closed tube position if possible, right? So for instance, right here, concert C on baritone, low E going to low A, okay? So if the main key you're in, the final cadence of the piece you're at is a low concert C, it's gonna, that's a great key for baritone. And basically the keys in red, not talking concert pitch, I think the trickiest keys for saxophones to play in general are B major, C sharp major, and F sharp major, and the corresponding minor keys. They just get clunky when you're arranging technical pieces. And so I basically outlined those in red based on the transposition, right? So soprano and bass being B flat instruments, baritone being E flat. And then on top of that, I put in yellow or red if a closed tube note is tonic in the baritone and bass, right? So G sharp to D sharp on bass, A flat to E flat, A to E. If your tonic is A flat or A, that means the two thinnest notes, right? If I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here, but closed tube note is like the more fingers you depress down to produce the note on saxophone, right? So a low C it sounds pretty powerful compared to, say, an A flat or an A. So on bass, if you're in the key of G flat major minor, G major minor, that means your tonic note is an A flat or an A, which is going to sound way thinner than anything below. And again, this is talking about idiom. I'm not saying you should never arrange a piece that's in these keys. But just something to think about preliminarily before you go into is, how, what is this a powerful piece? If so, you might want to put it in a key where the long tube notes can play a bigger role. Okay, so up on the soprano part, I outlined an arpeggio 1-3-5 or 1 flat 3-5, depending on whether you're in major or minor. And I kind of again outlined for B, C sharp, and F sharp. I could even use the highlighter tool maybe. No, I can't. It's not going to work. That generally, if the soprano is playing some really technical violin lines from a string quartet arrangement, avoiding all those sharps or flats, I think is a good idea in terms of idiom. I've also found, just in my own playing, I don't know how many other people feel about this, but one of the biggest technical glitches for me when I'm playing fast stuff is that D sharp to F sharp. on any saxophone. I just find that my ring finger and pinky tend to get hung up. So again, if you're a good saxophonist can play anything, and of course we're always working to improve and just have complete mastery, technical mastery over our instrument. But if you're planning on arranging something to share with other people, you can kind of predict what the hangups might be depending on the skill level of the group. So this is not a scientific chart. This is just what I've found over years of arranging, that the good keys to choose are C, D flat, E flat, F, G, A flat, and B flat. And obviously many of those are familiar to us because we've been playing most of the same six keys, at least the major ones, since beginning band, right? You start with concert F, concert B flat, add E flat and A flat. These are just good keys for wins, I think sometimes, but definitely for saxophone, I have found this to be a good thing to think about. Let's now quickly talk about an arrangement I did a while ago. Sebelius is Voces Intime. And I'm going to pull up the score, the original, real fast. Let me get rid of that. And screen shared this. Okay, so this is the fifth movement of Sebelius' string quartet, which Zizek's recorded on our second album, my arrangement of this, and it's in D minor, the original, right? So tonic is low D. Wait, did I get that right? Yes, okay, I'm sorry. So tonic is in D minor, and if I were to do an arrangement of this and keep it in the original key, that would mean it was E minor in the soprano and B minor in the bari. Okay, so what I felt when studying this was there's such a dark quality to this piece, and I find that D minor, the actual key of D minor, regardless of transposition, you starting on D on any saxophone, has a really dark sound. And so when I was first working on this, I had it transposed, but then I realized I think the soprano part's going to work better if I just leave it where it's at. If I have Stacy play the first note instead of transposing it, and have her actually just play this written out violin part. Okay, so then if you think about that, okay, if I leave the soprano part in D minor, then the overall key of the piece becomes C minor. Okay, and again, this is a really, really dark piece. Then what's the lowest note on the bari part? What's the last note, the powerful chord at the end, is going to be a bari on a low A. So that's kind of how I arrived at that decision after working on it. And I don't know if I have the recording ready. Here, I'll just... stop. I don't know if I set that up for everyone to hear. I just want to play the ending so you can hear what it sounds like when the bari plays the low A at the end versus if I had left it in the original key, would have been a low B. Let me see here. Okay, there we go. Sharing computer sound. Okay, and then the very end, it gets very exciting at the end. Everyone can tell that's a low A, right? At the end, it just the longest, the most closed tube note on any saxophone just has its power, right? And also, you might have heard there's a lot of altissimo in the soprano line, so there are plenty of moments in that arrangement where, because I picked a key that ended up transposing lower versus the original, that the soprano part goes up into the altissimo register less than it would have otherwise. So that actually, I think in the end, that choice made the piece flow a little bit better, or at least differently than if I had stuck with the original key. Let's see here. So again, that's just talking about key signatures on their own. Some things to think about: which keys work well, maybe don't work as well. And I guess the next logical thing to talk about would be transposition. Okay, this can be a controversial topic when speaking of traditional standard classical repertoire. Is if you've studied the affect of certain keys in certain periods, the really traditionalist approach is that the music should be in the original key. Some things to think about are one, concert A has crept up over the centuries. So the concert pitch we're hearing now when we play in modern tuning, it is not the same as what it once was. And I'm going to show you an instance of Bach. And again, we often talk about the affect of certain keys being paramount to certain pieces. But I'm going to show you the score to the first movement of one of Bach's cantatas. And the music might look a little familiar once I pull it up here. Okay, let me share the screen. Okay, and we'll play look at this organ part here. The music probably looks a little familiar to most of you. We're talking about, we're leading up to a discussion about the Bach's third violin partita, the first movement of. But you can see here that that violin partita is in E major, and obviously this version, which he wrote first, is in D major. So he swiped his own music and transposed it up so it worked better, or at least differently, on the violin. So I've shown you all that Bach himself, and I'm not saying that means any key is up for grab when you're transposing, but even in the era of affects of certain keys, he took his own music and was moving keys around all over the place. So okay, so here you're looking at the original version of this. And I've done a saxophone quartet arrangement of this piece fairly recently, so I wanted to show a little bit of that. And then the violin version is in E major, which I believe I have here as well. Yep, I can share this, so you get a look at it. Right, so this is the same piece we were just looking at. The solo organ line now becomes solo violin by itself without the brass consort at the beginning of the cantata. And this is in E major. Okay, so I just arranged this for saxophone quartet, and I chose, I felt like I had two decisions, well, three really. I could keep it in the original key and have the soprano saxophone playing in F sharp major and the bari and alto playing in C sharp major, and I just thought this piece is just supposed to fly. I wanted it to be really sparkly, like a fanfare, like overture kind of opening to a concert, and I just thought that having all those sharps in the key signature was not going to make it sound as effortless as I wanted. So I said, okay, well, I can move this up or down, right? It's in E major, so I can go to concert F, I raise the soprano line up, or I can move it down a step to E flat, and neither of those ranges really affect the dominant tonic relationship in the bari part. Well, I chose E flat, and was at least partially inspired, again, like I mentioned, the fact that pitch has creeped up over the years. Us playing in concert E flat is really not that far away from where E would have been, potentially, when Bach wrote this. So it could be, depending on whether or not we're sharp when giving a performance of this, at pretty close to the same pitch level it would have been at. But anyway, case in point, when speaking of transposition, I wanted to use that as an example. I'll pull up a little bit of the saxophone quartet arrangement here. Let's see here. And unfortunately, I do not have a recent recording of this. I do have a MIDI file that I thought about playing, but glancing at the time, I don't think I will subject you all to that. So you can see here, Barry begins on a low C at the beginning. The soprano is now in concert E flat. That's the original. I want to use this piece as a little bit of a case study, maybe to talk about, because this is a recent one I've done. So obviously all the things I'm talking about that I've learned over the years, this is the latest version of my formula when I'm arranging. Let me get rid of that real fast. Pull up my notes here. Oh, I have one other thing to show you. These are my notes that I made before I ever sat down and started notating or writing out the parts. Oh, another question you all might have is, do I, or when you're arranging, should you just sit at notation software if you're using it and just start plugging in notes and messing around, creating a logic puzzle of putting notes here and there? I don't think that's a bad way to go at all. But I did want to show you this for that reason is what I've penciled in is a rudimentary analysis of the key structure, right? So, and I don't use Roman numerals when I sit down. I don't turn this into a theory assignment. I do what Steve Lates recommended to me when I was studying theory with him, and he said, I just write the lead sheet chord symbols in major key areas, like listen in for cadences and mark those, and then I'll go back and add in more details as I need them. But what I've done, I listened to many different versions of this and pre-existing arrangements, and came up in my head with the sound I wanted, for the Sax Quartet version, what I wanted it to sound like. And you can see here what I wrote after arriving at that in my head when I sat down to do some work with pencil and paper. I said, I started orchestrating a little bit. I went the alto line to have the melody here, soprano here, alto here, soprano there. I made a little note here because I realized that these two lines here, alto and soprano, if you combine them together, produces fairly decent invertible counterpoint. And I thought, I'm arranging some Bach, that might be something cool to throw in. I'm sorry, no, it's not that, not these first two bars, it's these two bars, right? And maybe I can show you back in the score if there's time. Okay, so then I wrote here, there's a sequence, okay, and there's many different ways to shorthand write musical sequences. I again use Steve Lates' version from The Complete Musician, descending second sequence, or a circle of fifths progression with interlocking sevenths, and I wanted a pedal in the bass line. End up in a D2 sequence in the bass line with a strong tonicization of the dominant, 5 of A major, and I wanted to canonize this melody between the 3 upper voices, right? So again, I kind of, before I even started writing out the lines, I kind of created in my own head what I wanted it to sound like. Taking a solo violin piece and extrapolating it into a piece for quartet is going to require you to understand the harmony of the piece. So you do, I had to do quite a bit of analysis before this particular piece, and write using good voice leading and counterpoint and accompaniment to often go with the solo lines that are being thrown around the ensemble. And again, I wanted this to be a really kind of showy opener for saxophone quartet. I kind of feel like sometimes the Sax Quartet repertoire lacks really great, powerful 4 to 5 minute openers. That's another discussion though. So let me show you now that you've seen my notes there. Maybe I can talk through a little bit of this, my arrangement, before we move on. So, okay. So again, opening, a bunch of lines trading around. I'm really sorry I don't have a good recording of this I've played it twice, and neither time the recording turned out. But here's that one moment I was talking about, right? The invertible counterpoint between the alto and soprano line that I had envisioned, which you can see now it's transposed, and the alto is obviously below the soprano line. I mentioned that I wanted to turn the E pedal and the bass line here while the sequence is going on top. And if you know the piece, you know how difficult that is to play on saxophone. I give the tough part to the alto line. One of the reasons I did that, again, I'm sorry if I'm going like real fast through this, but this is a challenging part, and I actually wanted to throw that in the background of the arrangement, that dee-do-dee-do, 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 where the violin's doing all the string crossings. And I gave the melody and the soprano and tenor lines around that, so the alto player didn't feel like they had to be at 100% execution and projection while going through that. I will say with this arrangement, I think I had planned to mention this later, but I'll just mention it now. There's a really awesome arrangement of this that Rachmaninoff did for solo piano. And he took every note from the original in E major for violin, and it's in his arrangement somewhere. But he did all kinds of cool things with the harmony. So for this, I took on the Rachmaninoff challenge. I said I want every note to be in the quartet version somewhere, but I added a little bit of colorful harmonies here and there. So oh yeah, and then the pedal, the concert E flat, since I transposed. Then heads into a circle of fifths progression before the big cadence at 29. So I thought it might be helpful to show, I guess some of the background work that I do going into any arrangement. And if it's a tonal piece, I definitely spend a lot of time analyzing, understanding the harmony, the trajectory. So then when I have to make creative decisions where to drop a note or change things, that I have an idea of what to do. So, okay, let's talk a little bit about voice crossings. Okay, so in an ensemble setting, soprano, alto, tenor, bari, bass, they each have their range, and the smaller the instrument, the higher it is. I want to show an example from Danelle Espinosa's arrangement of the Rite of Spring for saxophone ensemble. This might be hard to see because it's a big score. Okay, and let me go ahead and play the audio file from this as well. I'm sorry about that. I know I'm in the wrong spot, so I'm really sorry about that. This is where I wanted to start. Here we go. You can't see all the parts. I think hopefully everyone could see a little bit, could hear at least the way he orchestrated this out. Okay, this part of the piece, there's a lot going on, and he, I think, cut out a lot of parts material in the other instruments, but there's this chorale going on, 4-voice chorale. And I thought what he did was really ingenuitive. It's a really good idea in any arranging is using families of instruments in large ensembles. So if we're talking about arranging for wind band, thinking in terms of the woodwind family or the brass family, or for us, the saxophone. He basically turned that 4-part chorale into a saxophone quartet in the middle of the saxophone ensemble. And if you look at the range everyone's playing in, it's a pretty good range for everyone to kind of project through the ensemble while there's this busy texture going on. I should have mentioned that before I played it so everyone could listen for it. But there are obviously higher and lower things going on than that chorale. And he obviously has the 3 lower voices playing higher than some of the other parts. So the decision you might have, if you were going to try and arrange the Rite of Spring for saxophone ensemble and you arrive at this part, you're looking at the pitches in a certain area going, top to bottom on the score. And he opted to use that, the Sax Quartet as an ensemble to play that part and cut through the ensemble that way, versus just saying like, oh, I'll give the top two voices to soprano and the lower two voices to alto. Yeah, it would work. All the notes would still be there in the right spot, but this creates a really interesting sound for that particular moment. The next, let's continue with Russian composers for a moment. The next example I wanted to show, speaking about like voice crossings, but in particular, this will be talking about tessitura, is when you're playing on saxophone, regardless of the voice you're playing on, soprano, alto, tenor, bari, bass, if you're playing a high note, it's going to kind of sound like a high note. Okay, so if you're arranging and you have a bunch of like really high thin string parts going on, yeah, you could transpose those directly and give them all to the sopranos, but it might not sound as thin and light as you would like in real life execution. So one thing you can keep in mind is that when you're playing above the staff on the saxophone, it's going to kind of sound high, even though the say for instance the tenor is an octave below the soprano line. So I'll stop sharing that again. This is the arrangement of, this is an early arrangement of mine, by the way, of Prokofiev's Classical Symphony that I did for the Eastman Saxophone Project, the third movement. Let me pull up the score here and share it, and then I will play a recording. Again, I apologize for these scores. I know it's hard to see everything that's going on. And the moment I'm going to talk about is actually right here. Okay, so let me play this for you, and then I will talk about it. All right. I believe this is where I want. Recording. Sorry. Okay, so and screen share that again. What I did in that section, that melody that was in the tenor saxophone section was actually in the original, I believe, in the oboes. And when I arrived at this moment, as you can see in the orchestra version, a lot of the upper voices drop out. Right, and there's a sort of pedal going on with some textural stuff in the other voices, and I was left with this conundrum. Okay, well, I want this to sound less loud and busy than what had just happened before, where the full ensemble is playing. So I didn't necessarily want the sopranos to continue playing, knowing, that in an ensemble, the sopranos playing three of them a melody over these soft pedals going on, it could be a little top heavy. So instead of putting it in the soprano line, I gave it to the three tenor saxophones. And again, obviously it's going to sound an octave lower than the original, but I hope you all heard that because of where it's at in the range of the tenor, it does cut through. And it also had a pecky quality similar to the oboe section in the original. So I want to posit the thought for you all when you're arranging that you don't necessarily need to take every pitch at the level it's at, right? If there's a high A in the violin, you're not breaking some awful rule if you do some octave displacement, right? To make it sound a little, again, more idiomatic for saxophone. The next thing I want to talk about in line with this is to go back to what I mentioned before about short versus long tube notes on the saxophone. I have a couple diagrams I want to show you. Okay, so here we go. This is the lower three voices, and I find it handy. I mean, at this point, having played saxophone for so long and arranged a lot and playing different voices, I don't need a transposition chart in front of me to help arrive at a quick decision when I'm making an arrangement. But some of you might find it really helpful to just spell out the chromatic scale at pitch levels for all the different saxophones. That's all this is, right? So I'm starting with bass, the long tube notes, and then adding the bari at the same pitch level. I wanted to suggest this to keep in mind if you do have like a really powerful low note. I think sometimes it can be good to have the instrument that has that when they play that pitch would be the long tube version of that note can sound bigger, deeper, heavier, whatever than actually the lower voice playing it. So for instance, let's say in an ensemble, I don't know if the highlighter is going to work. It's not going to work. But maybe you can see my mouse. I'm not sure. If the bass were to have a G, perhaps you could get a different tone color by having the bari section play a low D, right? As we all know, the short stack notes, G sharp up through G up through C sharp, basically, unless we do something as players to help with projection, can sound thinner than the rest of the register. So I find that particularly helpful to think about sometimes in the three lower voices. Donnell does this a lot in his arranging. We recently in Fusion did an arrangement of Bach's Italian Concerto, and he did that a lot. He had the tenor and bari parts swapping roots and fifths to produce that desired effect. Let's see here. Okay. Oh, I want to quickly mention some ideas about intonation. And I'm going to ask everyone, I know there's some non-saxophonists tuning into this, but those of you that are saxophonists, okay, I want you to imagine a concert F chord being scored for saxophone quartet. And again, if you're following the voice leading rules that I showed you for 2 seconds earlier in the presentation, if you're a concert F major chord means that 3 of the voices are going to probably be playing Ds. Okay, so and let's just say this will be a higher voiced concert F chord. So bari would have D with the octave key. Tenor, let's put them on the 5th. They'll have a D with the octave key. Soprano will double the root, which is a high D. The missing part of that chord is the 3rd, which would be C sharp in the alto, or if you want to revoice the inner voices, an F sharp in the tenor. Sometimes when you're making decisions in an arrangement, we all know that the saxophone has some interesting tuning tendencies in all the ranges. And I think sometimes you can write in solutions to those problems in the arrangement itself. For instance, we're talking about a key in F major, and you arrive at a big, powerful moment, or even a soft moment. Actually, soft is a better example for this. And you orchestrate the chord like I just mentioned, right? So that everyone's kind of on sharper pitches. That can help them get that chord in tune in a live performance setting. Again, I'm not, none of these are, I'm not writing like rules and guidelines like Steve Lates did in his voice leading thing, but these are things that I've over time learned to think about. I'm trying to remember. Back to the Prokofiev, I learned a lot about tuning and orchestration in the other movements of that. That was one of the earliest arrangements I did for the Eastman Saxophone Project, and I walked away from that experience just thinking, man, I wish I hadn't done that. I could have done that instead. And that's another point I want to make. When I was just talking with Dr. Nab before we started the online presentation here, I said, what I often hear from my composer friends is that the best way to get better at composing is to hear your own compositions played. And I found the same thing true as an arranger. I learn the most when I send one of my arrangements out to another group and they send me a recording back. Because, again, if I'm arranging for my friends or people that I know, I think sometimes that creeps in there. But if I just send this thing I've notated as best I can out into the world, and then I hear what people just reading, how they interpret it, that's when I've learned the most. So I highly recommend if you're first getting started with arranging, or you want to get into it, don't know where to begin, I would just start with a 4-part Bach chorale. Arrange it for a saxophone quartet. And I like to, I'm doing an arranging project with my students right now that is this exercise. Pick a key. What key would that chorale work best in for saxophone quartet to accomplish something? For instance, I'll just show you quickly. For those of you that know the Glazunov saxophone quartet, know that the beginning of the second movement has a really difficult melody in the soprano saxophone. It's down low, right? And it has all kinds of major thirds everywhere. So this is one of Bach's 4-part chorales, loosely translated to "You Are a Great Man of Sorrows." And this is not the original key from the cantata or wherever I pulled this from. But I transposed it so that the range in the soprano line roughly followed that of the chorale melody from the second movement of the Glazunov. Because I thought, as an exercise, it would be cool for my quartet at the time that was learning this to learn to tune with the soprano playing in the same range as it was in that piece. And I'm giving this to my students at VCU right now as an assignment. I said, they could arrange something else if they wanted, but I just suggested picking a Bach chorale and identify what is a potential issue with this chorale in a certain key, or do you want to leave it in the original? Keeping in mind a lot of the stuff that I mentioned about the other pieces earlier. But yeah, most important when you're arranging something is to hear it played back so you can hear what it sounds like. Okay, let's see here. I don't know exactly how much time we have. I think he budgeted an hour and a half. So I only have a little bit to go over before I wrap up with my closing thoughts, and then then I'm happy to stick around as long as needed for Q&A. Okay, this is a cool moment. So talking about balance issues, again, I'm going back to the short versus long stack notes on saxophone. D to E with the octave key are just really notes on the saxophone that just really project. I have another diagram to pull up here. Actually, I'm going to have to screen share this in Finale, I think. Here we go. Okay. Portion of screen. And here we go. Okay. So what I've notated here, I had a better version of this in a PDF, but I don't know where it went. So D, D sharp, and E on all the instruments: bass, baritone, tenor, alto, and soprano. And what this chart shows you again is just the transposition at pitch level for every instrument. When we're playing D, D sharp, and E on the saxophone, those tend to be very sharp notes on the horn. But I wanted to show you in comparison, if you look, those often equate to left stacked notes in another instrument. G, G sharp, A in the tenor, A sharp, B. Oh, I didn't include the soprano part up here, but that's where that would be. Again, thinking of thick, full notes versus thin, lighter notes. And on that note, I want to show you the arrangement I did for the Sax Quartet, one of the movements of Rachmaninoff's Vespers. This is where I broke a voice crossing rule, and I want to explain why. So let me pull up the score and share the recording. Okay, so this is the fourth movement of Vespers. I believe this is the first track on Zizek's second album, Intersections. But I want to key in on this moment here. And let's listen to it first. So, you can see what I did here in measure 18. It's in, 4-part SATB standard voicing here. But when I got to this new section in 19 with the Barry solo, take a look at the tenor line. C, B flat, C, slurred all the way up to a high C sharp, which ends up being over the A sharp and the soprano. And again, many of you are thinking, Matt, you just talked to me all this time about tuning and register. Why on earth would you do that? And the reason I did that is because that voicing of the chord, again, I wanted to keep the ensemble sounding really light, delicate, and soft, versus the Barry solo, which is also soft, but a little more shapely, that produces chords that are all in the left stack of all the instruments, right? High C sharp in the tenor, A sharp in the soprano, C sharp in the alto. So we could really work on matching tone color. Obviously, that made my part in the tenor a little more difficult because I had to lower all those notes in the upper octave, but it's doable. And I think the effect of that was really nice. I don't know in the recording that we played if it was perfectly in tune or anything, but that's why I opted to do that. And I think a good example of some some things you can do when working out orchestration in an ensemble arrangement. Let's see here. I want to make sure I talked about all the main things I made notes of. Okay. I forgot to mention when discussing the Bach partita, I did mention that Rachmaninoff had a really cool arrangement of that everyone should check out. But when I am arranging standard pieces, I will often investigate and see if there are other pre-existing arrangements. For Bach's pieces, there often are a number of great composers that have adapted his music. In the case of the partita, there are arrangements done by Saint-Saëns, Schumann, Mendelssohn, Rachmaninoff, and then some lesser names. So I would be completely lying to you if I didn't say I listened to all those and studied all those scores and and discovered how those composers had already adapted Bach's work and turned it, into something else. And I definitely stole my favorite chords from Rachmaninoff in my arrangement. So I think oftentimes there are already arrangements out there that you can sort of research. The reason I'm stuttering right now is I just realized I forgot to share one other piece with you that I really do want to share. Okay, so this is back related to the voice crossing thing. Okay, this is a technique I use a lot in saxophone quartet arrangements, which is so Project Fusion, we've recently started playing a lot of video game music, doing video game covers. And if you play video games, if you know video game music, depending on the genre, the scores can range from complete orchestral symphonic, like soundtrack kind of thing, or they can be really repetitive, less bit, using like the sound card of the console that you're playing, and composers get really creative with the effects that especially like retro machines have. So when you're arranging video game music, you're producing a cover of that tune. They're often very simple harmonically. I often joke that like every video game piece is based on the progression 1 flat 7 flat 6 flat 7 1. They're often very repetitive themes, and that can be a real challenge when you're translating it to acoustic instruments. So one thing I do a lot, and this just doesn't apply to video game music, but other pieces too, is trading the melody between the alto and soprano. For all the reasons that I mentioned previously. So first, let me pull up the score and play a bit of that recording for you. Okay. So here's the score. This is the theme for Dr. Wiley's theme from Mega Man 2. And you can see there's a sort of rhythmic thing going on in the Barry line, an accompaniment line going on in the tenor and soprano, and I give the melody to the alto. And now I'm going to play, Oh, no, that's the beginning. That's still video game music. Um, Here we go. All right. And that gave that line to the I didn't screen share the score, but you heard it. Here, let me oh, you didn't hear any of that, did you? Oh my goodness. I have to play it again. I'm so sorry. Um, okay. You're just watching me stare at my computer. That's so embarrassing. Okay, so here is what I just was describing to you. There we go. Okay, so I'll leave the score up for a second. So again, in video game music, it's often the melody. This is from a 16-bit console, so the melody is always usually in the upper voice. And there had been a long period of like the melody being in the soprano. What you'll notice about this, the key we're in, is that's a really great range for an alto player to play a really smooth, jazzy solo. Dig in. He had a nice like. Gliss and growl on the high E there. He really sold it. And that's a technique I use in a lot of our video game arrangements just to mix up the texture and make it more interesting because, again, part of the, at least in the video game genre, part of the charm is, sometimes in the early consoles, the robotic kind of feel or the limitations of the sound card. But when you are doing an acoustic cover of a piece like that, you have to be a little inventive. To produce something that's going to sound, as exciting or just exciting in a live performance. So, okay, the last thing I wanted to just briefly mention, I'm sorry, I've gone a little longer than I anticipated. I apologize for my slow screen sharing throughout. Is just a more aesthetic discussion about arranging in general. Okay. So I've often found the saxophone community to be a kind of polarized on whether playing arrangements is a good idea. I personally do a lot of new music, especially I'm in an electric acoustic new music ensemble. I really love promoting new works for our instrument, but I also think there is value in arranging. So I think there's a few things to think about. One, I don't think it's a bad idea at all for us as learning, growing musicians to work on transcriptions or arrangements just for our own benefit, like learning new pieces, understanding the tradition of tonal music, the canon of repertoire that existed before our instrument was even invented. I think it's a great idea to bring in, solo box solo string works for lessons just to talk about musicality and tonality. A completely different question is, should you program these pieces either getting paid on a concert series for an audience why would you present this in public? So I always ask myself two questions before I go making any arrangement. And one is, why am I adapting a pre-existing work of art or a masterpiece? Why am I taking something that already exists in the world, that a composer created, and changing it into whatever? And then the second question I ask is, if I'm going to do that, do I want to, again, make it more idiomatic for the saxophone, or am I going to try and recreate the original sound as best as possible? Obviously, there's no one-size-fits-all answer for either of those questions. There are some pieces of music that I would never consider arranging for saxophone. The one that comes to mind immediately whenever I talk about this is Brahms's Intermezzo in A major for piano. It's just this beautiful, gorgeous piece, and I could never imagine. Obviously, as a great piece, I would love to play it, either on piano or otherwise. But I don't think I'd ever program it in public, a saxophone arrangement of that. Conversely, there are pieces that I think work really well for saxophone. For instance, this is an interesting one. So I mentioned Rite of Spring. That was interesting because it caused almost as much controversy when the Eastman Saxophone Project played it as it did when it was first premiered. But there are some saxophonists that thought, why'd you do that? Why should that exist? And then for us, for me playing that, I was like, man, this is a piece I never thought I'd get to play. It was so cool. We learned a lot. I'm sorry. I jumped thought here. We did an arrangement of Interreise for saxophone, ensemble, and vocalist. And that's, a song cycle for singer and piano. A saxophone ensemble sounds nothing like the piano. But when I was studying that work and discussing, with Chin Kwan at the time, our repertoire, I said, there's a lot of moments in the song cycle where Schubert is evoking the wind. The wind rustling and some of the movements. The last movement, Der Leiermann, features the hurdy-gurdy. If you're familiar with the song, there's just this droning fifth with grace notes in the piano and the singer singing, the baritone singing this haunting melody on top. And I thought, this rustic air wind quality that Schubert is evoking, I think there are some moments that the saxophone could add that too. The recording's up if you want to check it out. I thought some of that worked quite well. Another example would be, again, talking about those two questions I mentioned. Why are you adapting an existing piece? And then two, are you going to make it more idiomatic for saxophone or try and recreate the original? I did an arrangement of Bartók's 6 Romanian dances. That actually has been played by it's been played by a couple professional quartets, which I thought was really cool. The Navy Band Sax Quartet played it, I think, at one of the Navy Band symposiums a few years ago. So I arranged that for Project Fusion because we all studied with Chin Kwan Lin, and he is a former violinist. Well, he still plays violin, but not as much anymore. And that was a piece we heard him play on a faculty recital on soprano saxophone. He said, I'd been playing this piece for so long, I just thought it sounded cool on soprano. And that was a lasting impression that made on us as students there. And I don't remember how we started bopping around the idea of doing that piece, but some of you may know, Bartók spent a great deal of his life traveling the Transylvanian countryside, meeting people and recording down folk melodies of people, singing these rustic folk songs or playing them on rudimentary wind instruments. So again, there was this quality in Bartók's original, which was for piano, and then he expanded it for strings. So he did an arrangement of his own piece. And then there's the more commonly known, I believe, version for violin by Slaminsky. I believe that's right. That's used as a piece for younger violinists often. But Bartók himself, those melodies probably would have been played on reed instruments or wind instruments. And so I mentioned, this actually is a good case study maybe to end my talk on before we do any questions. Researched the existing arrangements and decided I want to make this sound a little more idiomatic for the saxophone. I want it to sound kind of rustic and folksy, and that's something our instrument can do well in a saxophone quartet setting. And so, again, I borrowed the good ideas that I found in the other arrangements and then changed some things to make it sound, like I said, a little more folksy. So, okay, I appreciate you all so much for hanging around. I went 10 minutes over the allotted hour. I apologize if I accidentally didn't screen share or anything or missed a recording. But now I'm going to open the chat window here. I see there's some messages. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know, and I'll do my best to answer them. So let's see here.
Hey Matt, we had a question earlier in the talk. This is Ali.
Yeah.
From Kevin. He said, "Can you give us some insight into the journey you've gone through as far as getting permission, clearing for copyright, and for publishing and/or recording?"
Okay. I'll have to answer this carefully because I'm in Army uniform right now. But so this is first of all, I should say I'm not an expert on this. I will offer the advice that I can. I wanted this primarily to be like a talk about the nitty gritty, how to actually arrange. But obviously, this is, if you want to play a piece that isn't in public domain, that's a big hurdle. So what I found, it depends on the piece you're playing. For the video game stuff, covers are allowed of that material. What isn't allowed is taking those melodies, or taking those pieces, writing it out, and then selling your own version. Again, it's like the artistic equivalent of, let's say you draw a picture of Super Mario, and you post it online. You say, "Hey, look at this cool thing I drew of Super Mario," and you're putting it out there for free for people to see, and they see your work that you've done, but you're not selling it, and you're not taking the content of the game and saying that you made it or something and profiting from it. So when it comes to arranging things that aren't in the public domain, it depends on how you're using it. If you're just putting out a free YouTube video, depending on the content creator, they may or may not decide to say, no, you need permission to do that. And it depends on their copyright claim as well. In general, though, I would say sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And when you're in school, for those of you that are students and wanting to experiment with some arranging, that can be part of the learning process too, is like picking a piece, doing something with it, putting out there, seeing what happens. But what I found is sometimes if it's for the video game pieces, those big corporations won't deal with independent artists. They only deal with bigger companies. So often there's no way for Even Fusion to reach out and see if we could get permission to do it. It all depends on how you use it. I will say, when we did the Rite of Spring arrangement, that might be a good case study to mention with the question you just asked, is that piece is public domain in the United States, but it's not in Europe. So we put out the video. It kind of went viral. I think it got quite a few views when we put the video out first. And then Boozy and Hawks filed a copyright claim, and they took the video down. So I don't remember exactly what happened, the steps in between that, but we got the video back up, and as part of the negotiation was that because it was able to be distributed in the US, then we could somehow put it out there for US viewers to see, but it wasn't supposed to be viewable by those in Europe. Conversely, though, I will say, if you YouTube search the Rite of Spring, there are a number of arrangements out there that Boozy and Hawks seem to be just fine with. So again, that's an instance where I don't know if it was, I don't even want to speculate why they didn't want our free version, our version of that out there. But I would say, I don't know, I kind of want to leave it there. I'm not a super expert on this kind of stuff. And again, most of the stuff I'm arranging lately is public domain, or these like video game covers, which I don't really distribute my arrangements of those. We just kind of put out recordings. But I hope that kind of answered the question. Let's see here. And did you notice any other good questions?
No, well, that was the only question during the talk. Everything else is at the bottom of the chat.
Okay, let me see here. I see some notes about Mega Man. Okay, there's that thing about copyright. Okay, a common occurrence in Baroque music is solo violin arpeggiating chords in the 16 notes. If there are large jumps in a chord, Single sax can have trouble hitting all the notes clearly, but if you split the phrase, it doesn't sound smooth. Definitely two different voices. Okay, any suggestions? Okay, let me pull up in my arrangement of the Bach chaconne. This is where what I mentioned about understanding harmony and voice leading can really come in handy, because like what this person's asking is a direct transcription of the notes actually written for the original violin is going to sound clunky. It's depending on the key you're in, can be really difficult. Trading the lines doesn't work either. So give me a moment here to pull up score to the Bach chaconne, and I can show you an example of that. Here we go. I don't have a recording ready of this, I apologize. But here at K, this starts in the section of Bach's chaconne in D minor, where they're rolled arpeggiating chords, right? And even in the score, Bach wrote basically chords in a row, and the first bar showing the arpeggiation, and then it said similar. Just do the same thing through that whole section. A violinist would know what to do. So what I did is through analysis and voice leading, I kind of created lines based on the voice leading that was implied in the original. And you can see, I gave the sopranos, similar to what I did in the partita arrangement with the alto part at the very beginning of the talk, if you can remember, is I gave the sopranos very softly a version of that I wanted to be underneath the longer lines in the middle of the range in the lower voices. And actually, maybe I can pull up ESP's recording so you can hear that really quickly. You could probably find that pretty easily. Okay, here we go. That's a great question, though. If you're playing a solo, if you're doing a solo piece, I don't know if you really have that option, but in an ensemble piece, you can get really creative with texture. Then I think the last question I see here, for arranging how to use the altissimo registers, do you tend to use them often, or are there rules when incorporating it? That is a great question. I find, okay, so again, like I said before, if you have 4 Vincent Davids in a quartet, they could basically play anything. So, if you're arranging for monster powerhouse players, yes, no rules, just write whatever you want. I find that the most idiomatic writing, again, if you're, speaking of idiom, is when the altissimo is used in a very big singing, high quality, similar to how, a soprano coloratura vocalist might go up in the high range. There are certain instances where you can't get away from putting high altissimo notes in the soprano sax part, and they just do their best to go for whatever you're going for in that moment. But again, you can sometimes do things to save for the big moments, right? When you really want it to sound bigger or higher or brighter. But altissimo can be, depending on how hard it is, you can set up a performer, I don't want to say for failure, but if it's not idiomatic, you can increase the chance that something's going to happen. When you're making an arrangement, if you can temper it a little bit. If it's a direct transcription, and you're not making any artistic arranging choices, then that's one thing. But if you're doing an arrangement and you can avoid some pitfalls, I think it's definitely wise to consider. Let's see here. A cappella groups are real popular now. Would these voicings be a good model for Sax Quartet? I think, yeah, there's a, I hope I'm understanding the question right, but I think there's a direct correlation between a cappella vocal groups and sax ensemble, because it's all the same voice, right? Literally, an a cappella group is a different, vocal, different voices and different ranges all singing together, and that's basically what a sax quartet is, just without lyrics. Yeah, there are so many cool things out there now saxophonists are doing, like the Moanin' Frogs are really super awesome. ESP, when I was at Eastman, was very modular. We had ensembles of different sizes plan our concerts, and and then a sax quartet obviously is the storied, oldest ensemble of saxophones there is. And obviously sax quartet is standard instrumentation in wind band music. At least the four voices of saxophones in the modern wind band is there. But there's, I think people are often surprised if they've never heard a saxophone ensemble before, how good it sounds. Again, the feedback I've gotten from our quartet performances is, we didn't know saxophone could sound like that. Because maybe people think when they hear the word saxophone of jazz or pop music or loud, things like that. But when an instrument of the same family plays together, with other instruments of that family, there's all these possibilities, right? And I guess what I shared today was some of those possibilities I've explored in my own arranging. So does anyone else have any other questions or anything? It's getting kind of late. Thanks everyone for sticking around. Oh yeah, okay, so thanks everyone for hanging out, and I will find a way, the things I said I'd share, the PDFs of those charts and diagrams, I can't promise I'll get it done tomorrow, but I will. I'll post it in the event page. I'll create a document version of those, and I'll post that. But thank you all so much for checking this out. I hope, maybe I offered a couple techniques to think about if you're making your own arrangements, or things to consider when you're deciding whether or not you do want to play an arrangement somewhere. So go saxophone. This is so cool. This thing that Dr. Nab arranged. I should have done this at the very beginning, but thank him for putting this amazing roster of pedagogues and professionals that I'm humbled to present alongside. I've been tuning in, or at least watching the videos after the fact, and I think this is just such an incredible resource that our community has put together during a terrible, terrible time, and it shows a lot about our community, the creativity, and passion, and drive, that saxophonists have. So. Okay. On that note, thanks everybody. Please feel free to message me if you have any questions or follow-up thoughts, things I might have missed, or recommendations you have for my own arranging, because I'm still working on that too. So, all right, everybody, have a great night, and hope to see you in person again someday soon.